Good morning. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of Ministry of Foreign Affairs, I would like to welcome you all at the conference on Prague agenda. My name is Jiří Schneider. I'm Deputy Foreign Minister of Czech Republic. I am pleased and honored to welcome you all here. It's not the beginning, because some of you have worked hard. Yesterday, I was told that the conference, which was organized yesterday, was quite interesting. I hope this final two panels will be no less interesting for you. The proof of the success of the conference is that there are participants coming. And 2 years ago, we organized the first conference on Prague agenda because we were trying to embrace the fact that President Obama delivered a speech on important strategic issues not far away from here. Last year, we organized a second conference. One could have said, well, it may be an accident, repetition, accidental repetition. But this year is the third time. It's becoming serious. Probably we will continue in this. And I hope there is a benefit for all of you, regardless of your background, country, your government, academia, think tank, to participate in these reflections annually in Prague. And so we are very happy to provide this opportunity. And I just want to underline, from what I've said and from what I've heard about yesterday meeting, I think there is a benefit and there is a high probability some of you will come again. So I want to extend the invitation to continue in this important debates. Of course, the circumstances change, and there are some unexpected circumstances always. I remember when President Obama delivered the speech, he didn't sleep too much, because before the speech, the night before, North Koreans launched a missile. It was a quite interesting circumstance for that speech. Today, these days, naturally, debates lean from nuclear portfolio towards chemical portfolio, and it's very sad what is happening in Syria. So these circumstances change, but the basic questions stay. And the speech of Mr. Obama is not the first speech of this kind, but it's a good point of reference for all elements of the agenda. There will always be an attempt for cherry picking, just to pick something from the speech. Those who like absolute disarmament like the first part of his sentence. I tend to forget, not in my life. Those who like to focus on arms control, like other paragraphs, but we would like to keep the speech and concept as a whole. And that's one of the, I would say, purposes and added values of this gathering, which will always have this point of reference in mind. Finally, I would like to welcome here distinguished guests from abroad. Thank you very much for coming, and we look forward to what you're going to say on this occasion and what you did yesterday in your reflections. Thank you very much for coming. I would like to thank Institute of International Relations, Charles University, Faculty of Social Sciences, and also Metropolitan University for contributing and helping with organizing this conference. Thank you very much, especially the people from the conference service of the Institute. I hope everything went smoothly, and so big thank you to all of you, and of course to our people from especially UN department in this ministry. Thank you very much for helping in organizing this conference. I would like to wish you a nice day. It's a kind of miracle, such a nice day outside, and you stay inside this building, and you're going to talk about these issues which probably don't have a quick fix. So thank you very much for coming. Enjoy this conference, and I pass floor to Veronika Kuchyňová, Šmigolová. Ambassador Kuchyňová is now chairing the annual cycle of Nuclear Supplier Group, which is another activity of Czech Republic, so it is only appropriate that she's going to chair the next panel. Thank you, Veronika, thank you all, and I wish you a pleasant stay and good debate.
Thank you very much, Jiří. I assure you I will not supply you with any nuclear materials today. Before starting the panel, I would like to ask Camille Grand to sum up the workshop from yesterday, to let also the people that did not participate to understand what went on. And yes, please, Camille.
Thank you. It's really a pleasure to be here today. My task this morning is quite complicated because I need to sum up in 5 to 7 minutes a 2 hours discussions on non-strategic weapons, which brought many of you together for a closed workshop. And I will do that through a few points, and I take this opportunity to thank the students from IIR that have provided me with a very good sort of summary of the discussion late last night, so I could use it in drafting these remarks. So, of course, the group agreed that the issue was currently in a stalemate for a variety of reasons. There was a lack of appetite on the part of some of the parties involved, and therefore a lack of readiness to engage. On the NATO side, there was a feeling amongst some of the participants that the strategic concept and the DDPR did provide a sort of good balance, and that therefore we should sort of stick to the current NATO policy. And many commented the fact that there were no signs of interest on the Russian side on this particular issue of non-strategic weapons in Europe. So that meant that the current disparity in stockpile and the current status quo was likely, at least in the short term, to be the most likely of 4 options that were depicted, one being negotiation, one being unilateral withdrawal. At the other end of the spectrum, you had the issue of modernization of the existing stockpile, and of course status quo, which appeared to be the most likely option. As one participant put it, as we don't fear war, we don't need to agree on anything specific. But the situation is not static, and this is one of the big takeaway as far as I'm concerned from yesterday's discussions. There are many domestic drivers, politics, budget, forced modernization, both in NATO countries and in Russia, that could alter the current situation and should be taken into account. There are also external drivers that may impact the NATO policy or the Russian policy, developments in Asia and in particular in the Middle East. So when we nevertheless, there were many ideas that were put forward to say that we could work at least towards creating the conditions for such a serious engagement on non-strategic weapons. We had a lengthy debate about transparency, how can we achieve more transparency. There were interesting comments on the fact that transparency could probably be primarily coming from on a bilateral basis rather than being entirely public, because that would probably ease some of the concerns of the participants in the discussions. There were also many interesting proposals dealing with the more modest measures that could be a very good start to get the debate moving forward. Inspection of closed storage facility was one example of good transparency and confidence building measure where there could be such visits on a more regular basis, and then slowly expand such confidence and transparency measures to a more broader agenda. There was a debate on what was the best format to achieve or decide such measures. The NATO-Russia Council was mentioned as probably the most, in spite of its lack of progress, was mentioned as a good format to do that because it was very inclusive and it included all the NATO countries, and therefore was there were some merits in using that format. Altogether, I think the group was insisted very much on the need for a better understanding of cross expectations. It was unclear in our debate what ultimately was the Russian position or interest in this. I mean, some argued that Russia had no interest whatsoever in moving forward because the status quo was the sort of preferable option. And others saw Russia seeking some sort of unilateral move on the part of the US and NATO. So there's probably a need to get a better understanding on the expectations. The same is to a certain extent true about NATO, because the NATO, beside the extended end for a negotiation, NATO isn't quite clear on what it is ready to do in the short term on this. So lastly, last 2 points, the issue of is of course, and that was very clear, and there I probably won't surprise you, is of course hostage to a series of broader issues, the more global disarmament agenda and the missile defense is quoted as a traditional sort of Russian precondition for engaging into this. The lack of progress and the stalemate on the conventional front as well, and of course the nature of the bilateral relationship, which is complicated by completely external factors such as Syria. The group felt there was an opportunity and a need to further debate NATO policy in the mid to long term, even though the group, I would say, was splitted on the need to change it, but that there was a sense that the future of extended deterrence and the requirements for extended deterrence, including the need for forward deployed weapons, could be discussed further, at least in the mid to long term, that the situation was likely to evolve due to a variety of factors that I've already mentioned. There was a debate on whether the redeployment could be possible in the event of if the weapons were removed from European soil, and there was a warning that it could be a one-way trip, if only for budgetary reasons. So on the whole, I think there was a shared understanding that, and vision that the debate was worthwhile being continued, that we had not exhausted every possibility. I must say, this is more of a personal remark, that even though I've attended many of these non-strategic weapons debate, there were some ideas and thoughts that were useful for my own thinking on the issue yesterday. So I guess it means that it's worthwhile both in academic circles and in more governmental circles to continue this discussion, to deepen it, at least to be ready when the conditions are met to be able to move forward with fresh ideas, even though progress seems to be difficult in the short term. So thank you very much, and thank you again for the team that provided me their own notes. And of course, I'm only reflecting very poorly the quality of the discussion, so thank you very much to all the participants who were very active. I must say that at the beginning, I thought, will we have a 2 hours discussion on a topic like this without a very specific agenda and papers being presented? And ultimately, we had, I think, a very interesting discussion, and I'm very thankful to all of you for your very active participation in this debate. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Camille, for your excellent summary and for highlighting the issues of yesterday. I think most of the things that were mentioned in the discussion yesterday will be discussed also today. So I hope we can continue in the same spirit and maybe go even deeper into some aspects of this challenging topic. So let's move now to the first panel of today's conference. The topic of this panel is called Prague Agenda After Berlin. It means we have noticed that Prague is not the only place where President Obama gives speeches, and well, of course, it also says beyond the New Start. So we are supposed, or our panelists are supposed to look into the options of what's going to happen next. We live in challenging and interesting times. The development in the world, as was already mentioned, is not very sympathetic right now to the non-proliferation agenda. On one hand, we should at least consider concrete steps towards a world with a much more limited number of nuclear weapons. On the other hand, there is a need to prevent nuclear proliferation and nuclear terrorism, also through strategic deterrence. Well, moreover, not only nuclear weapons of mass destruction, but chemical and other weapons of mass destruction are now more widely, well, not only discussed, but unfortunately also used. So this adds another point another dot into this topic. We have 4 very distinguished panelists today to touch upon all these issues. The first and foremost is Rose Gottemoeller. Welcome, Rose, to Prague. Rose Gottemoeller is acting Undersecretary for Arms Control and International Security and Assistant Secretary for Arms Control Verification and Compliance. Rose is certainly not new to this topic. She's dealing with the issues for many years. She was the chief US negotiator for the New Start, and before working for this government, she was director of Carnegie Moscow Center and senior associate with the Carnegie Endowment. So Rose, welcome again, and we look forward to your remarks.
Veronika, it's wonderful to be here in Prague on such a beautiful autumn morning. I've already had a walk to the top of the Petrin Hill and looked out over the city, and it is indeed a beautiful place, and I'm very, very happy to be back here again. I wanted to say thank you at the outset to the Czech Ministry of Foreign Affairs, to First Deputy Minister Jiří Schneider, to the Institute of International Relations in Prague, the Metropolitan University in Prague, and the Faculty of Social Sciences from Charles University for their work in putting this conference together. It's truly an impressive effort. My last visit to Prague was actually on the day that President Obama and President Medvedev signed the New START Treaty in April of 2010, which was also a beautiful day and an important day. But a lot of water has gone under the Charles Bridge in that time. Veronika's already mentioned that we live in interesting times, and I wanted to start out by saying that yes, we do live in interesting times, and in fact that is a Chinese wish, may you live in interesting times. Sometimes, you know, it has an ominous ring to it, and it implies that a person in an interesting world is doomed to failure and doomed to a tumultuous period. Well, I don't quite think about it that way. Indeed, we are living in interesting times with a certain inevitability of danger and uncertainty, but I also believe that we have the power to control and shape these times, and that we must continue to do so. We can see the challenges facing us ahead, and I believe that we can find ways to overcome these challenges. That's exactly what President Obama had in mind 4 years ago when he came to Prague and spoke of the intent of the United States to seek the peace and security of a world without nuclear weapons. His vision, which we call the Prague Agenda, was actually a continuation of the path that was set forth by previous US presidents. You know, the first time a president spoke about this was President Harry Truman in 1945. So every single US president in the nuclear age has felt the weight of this responsibility and the weight of the responsibility to limit and control all weapons of mass destruction. And I know from our long experience working together with the Soviet Union and with the Russian Federation that this is true for the leaders of the Russian Federation as well. Leaders and advisors, their advisors who bear these responsibilities, as well as countless others inside and outside of governments around the world, have all been working to stem the nuclear threat and find ways to push us back from the catastrophe of a nuclear war. So I know we'll talk about many of these directions this morning, and not only the efforts to reduce and limit nuclear weapons per se. The responsibility is ours to bear. There's no question about it. And now we are facing new and different threats. The likelihood of a large-scale nuclear exchange has diminished since the Cold War. And it's clear that the United States and the Russian Federation must continue the challenging disarmament work that we have underway, but nuclear dangers have not disappeared, nevertheless. The threat posed by the spread of nuclear materials and technologies remains very real. The possibility that terrorists or other non-state actors could acquire nuclear weapons ensures that the nuclear sword of Damocles continues to hang over us. While our nuclear arsenals have little direct relevance to deterring these kinds of threats, the threats of nuclear weapons in the hands of terrorists, nevertheless, everything we do to reduce and eliminate both nuclear weapons and fissile materials will strengthen the nuclear non-proliferation regime. A strong non-proliferation regime makes nuclear theft, unauthorized use of nuclear weapons or fissile materials, and proliferation much harder. The ultimate solution, as we see it, is pretty straightforward. Take away the tools, fissile material, nuclear weapons, and you take away the nuclear threat, ultimately. Of course, that's much easier said than done. President Obama made it clear in the Prague speech that the road to a world without nuclear weapons would be long, and as Veronika already mentioned, and also Deputy Foreign Minister Schneider, the goal would not be reached in the President's lifetime. To achieve success, we will need to follow a step-by-step process in which we maintain nuclear stability at the same time that we pursue responsible reductions in our nuclear capabilities through a number of measures, some of them quiet, and some of them front and center on the world stage. The negotiation and the ratification process for the New START Treaty, that was front and center on the world stage, but I'm very glad to tell you here this morning that now implementation of the treaty has been going forward for over 2 years. It's been going forward in a quiet, deliberate way, but it has been very successful. So that's off the center of the world stage, but nevertheless, I'm glad to tell you that it has been going forward well. Another accomplishment on the quiet front is the work that Russia and the United States have done to eliminate fissile materials from warheads. Over the past 20 years, we have together eliminated the highly enriched uranium from approximately 20,000 warheads. The highly enriched uranium has been transformed into low-enriched fuel and sold to power plants in the United States. Do you know that today, approximately 10% of the electricity in the United States is from nuclear warheads of the Soviet Union that have been eliminated? Now that's really turning swords into plowshares and is an amazing accomplishment, but a very quiet one. It's not enough, and I stress it is not enough. The United States and the Russian Federation still have over 90% of the nuclear weapons in the world. This past June, President Obama spoke in Berlin about the next steps in the Prague agenda. I will focus today on what he said about nuclear reductions. The President announced in Berlin, and I quote, "We can ensure the security of America and our allies and maintain a strong and credible strategic deterrent while reducing our deployed nuclear weapons by up to 1/3, end of quote. He also said that we would seek bold steps to reduce non-strategic nuclear weapons in Europe, and I very much welcome the discussion you had yesterday. I look forward to discussing more aspects of that effort today. How we go about these further reductions is a matter not only for Washington and Moscow, but also must involve close consultations with our allies. And these consultations are already going on in Brussels and in other capitals, both in Europe and in Asia. An essential element to the step-by-step process is reducing the role that nuclear weapons play in our national security strategies. That is why the President's new nuclear employment guidance directs the U.S. Department of Defense to align its planning with U.S. policy that the use of nuclear weapons will be considered only in extreme circumstances to defend the vital interests of the United States and allies and partners. In addition, the new guidance directs strengthening non-nuclear capabilities and reducing the role of nuclear weapons in deterring non-nuclear attacks. All of this derives from the principle underlying and articulated in our 2010 Nuclear Posture Review. That is, it is in the interest of the United States and all other countries that nuclear weapons never be used again. No secret, our efforts to move forward on the next steps are proceeding slowly. Many issues of strategic stability and beyond, issues of regional security, are taking up the so-called dialogue space. This does not mean we stop trying to move ahead. Even in the darkest days of the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union found it in our mutual interest to work together on reducing nuclear threats. Through creativity, patience, and persistence, we have many successes, and together we've contributed to a safer world. When New START is fully implemented in 2018, we will be at the lowest levels of deployed strategic nuclear weapons since the mid-1950s, the dawn of the nuclear age. It's quite a feat, but we still have more work to do. There is one simple reason to move ahead in this next step. It is in our mutual interest. Not only in our mutual interest in political and security terms, but also in budgetary terms as we face up to necessary pressures on our defense budgets. To end, I want to read you something by President Reagan's Secretary of State, George Shultz, that I came across recently. Speaking to the UN early in his tenure, which was now about 30 years ago, he outlined principles for action in foreign policy, and I think they can help to guide our discussions this morning. His comments focused on how and why the United States should conduct negotiations. I really do think the ideas ring true today, so I quote, "We manage our problems more intelligently and with greater mutual understanding when we can bring ourselves to recognize them as expressions of mankind's basic dilemma. We are seldom confronted with simple issues of right and wrong, good and evil. Only those who do not bear the direct burden of responsibility for decision and action can indulge themselves in the denial of that reality. The task of statesmanship is to mediate between two or several causes, each of which often has a legitimate claim. It is on this foundation that the United States stands ready to try to solve the problems of our time, to overcome chaos, deprivation, and the heightened dangers of an era in which ideas and cultures too often tend to clash and technologies threaten to outpace our institutions of control." This was 30 years ago, Secretary Shultz said these words, but they are absolutely right for today as well. His words will, I think, continue to guide our policy. I'm going to end there, and I look forward to hearing from all of you. I look forward to my fellow panelists' questions and comments, and I look forward to our discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rose, for this very much on-topic presentation. You said the implementation of this New START treaty is successful. You also emphasized that US and Russia have to continue the challenging disarmament work. And so I'm very happy I can welcome here in the panel one of the very few Russian guests at this conference, Mr. Eugene Miasnikov, who is a director of the Center for Arms Control, Energy and Environmental Studies in Moscow. He's not part of the government, but it means we might hear something more interesting and challenging from him. Mr. Miasnikov graduated from Department of Aerophysics and Space Research, which means he knows a lot about the topic. He was also a visiting fellow at the MIT. Mr. Miasnikov, we are happy to have you here. Welcome, and please.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure and honor to be here today in a panel with such distinguished experts in the field. And I'd like to thank the organizers for this opportunity. Let me also say that I'm really impressed with this city. This is the first time I'm in Prague, and with hospitality of the people who organize this important event. As I work for an NGO, of course I cannot speak for the Russian government. What I'd like to do today is to share with you my understanding of the Russian official attitude and make an assessment of the current situation in order to answer the question, what is realistic to achieve regarding further nuclear cuts? Perhaps the shortest statement to describe the Russian attitude is a formula: the world without nuclear weapons is not simply the present-day world minus nuclear weapons. This formula was first introduced by four old Russia's wise men 3 years ago in Izvestia newspaper. The essence of this statement is that nuclear reductions need to be conducted in a way that the world is not becoming less stable at the same time. According to this logic, we cannot avoid discussing a concept of strategic stability before moving to lower numbers. In Russia's view, there is a long list of factors that has an impact on strategic stability, and ballistic missile defenses, strategic conventional arms are among them. What is behind this position? Let me show you the graph illustrating a forecast for strategic delivery system deployment for the next 18 years, provided that the United States and Russia adhere to the START treaty over this period of time. The data on the graph were calculated in accordance with the results, with the rules provided by the START treaty currently in force. Blue curves represent US strategic systems and the red ones Russian systems. Dotted curves show aggregate numbers for deployed and non-deployed launchers. And solid curves show the number of deployed delivery systems. Two solid red curves shown for the Russian missiles and bombers represent two extreme scenarios of strategic forces development, the most optimistic and the most pessimistic ones. I'll elaborate on this a few minutes later. The graph might seem unfamiliar on the first glance because dynamics of nuclear reductions is usually illustrated by numbers of deployed warheads, not the numbers for delivery systems. In my view, the deployed warhead numbers are somewhat misleading for two reasons. First, as past experience shows, counting rules for warhead numbers are changed, and radical cuts in deployed warhead numbers don't always mean actual and irreversible reductions. Notable examples are Moscow Treaty of 2002 and frankly the New START as well. Counting rules for delivery systems is more or less stable, though they are also changed. Second, if you compare the numbers for US and Russian deployed warheads, you can see roughly a parity. But that is not the case for delivery systems, and for deployed launchers in particular, as this graph suggests. To some extent, this fact explains Russian concerns about survivability of its arsenal and unlimited development of ballistic missile defenses and strategic conventional arms. The graph also explains why Russia is interested in limiting US delivery systems, most of all, not the warhead numbers. Let me comment these graphs in more detail. According to Pentagon's existing plans, all 14 Trident strategic submarines that US Navy currently operates will be in service till 2027, and one submarine a year will retire after that. Starting 2030, the US Navy is going to get one new strategic submarine yearly to replace retiring submarines. Service life of Minuteman ICBMs is going to end not earlier than in 2030. Currently an option to extend the service life at least till mid-2070s is under discussion. Heavy bombers will also be capable to carry out nuclear missions at least till 2030, 2040s. One should also mention that at the time being there is a lively discussion in the US on renovation of nuclear triad and related issues. However, it's also important to stress that if existing delivery systems are to be preserved for at least 15 years to come, any US decision on replacement of delivery systems is unlikely to affect the blue curves on the graph any time before 2030. Unlike the United States, Russia has long been replacing its nuclear triad. The process of phasing out all delivery systems will likely continue till mid-2020s. All systems currently consist of about 80% of total deployed delivery systems. At the moment, this process proceeds with a pace that is still faster than the new missiles are built. The lower solid red curve assumes a hypothetical scenario that starting this year, Russia stops deployment of new ICBMs and strategic submarines, but the Navy will still get the 3 strategic submarines that are on final phases of production. The upper solid red curve represents a scenario when the strategic rocket forces will receive 18 ICBMs yearly until 2025, and the Navy will commission 1 Bray-class strategic submarine armed with Bulava missile each year, 8 submarines altogether in accordance with the state program for armaments till 2020. How realistic is the second scenario? The graph shows new ICBM deployment rate starting 1997, when the first Topolem SS-27 came in service. The graph clearly illustrates that increasing the rate of ICBM production to 18 missiles a year will be highly problematic. the rate of commissioning of one strategic submarine a year will be even more challenging given existing production rates for submarines. Thus, if the lower solid curve is the floor, the upper one is the ceiling for future deployed Russian missiles and heavy bombers. The most likely, Russia will have no more than 400 deployed ICBM submarine launchers and heavy bombers over the next decade. Let me also add that sometimes the argument is made that reductions would be beneficial to Russia because they would allow to save some significant money. Russia is still at the situation when it's trying to keep afloat its military production industry and in particular missile production capability. Currently, military production industry is seen by the Russian leadership as a locomotive to shift Russian oil and gas export-oriented economy toward high-tech. There might be a shortage of money for military procurement. However, more likely is the situation when military industry is unable to absorb the given money in an efficient manner because of loss of skills and professionalism during the last 20 years when military-industrial complex was short of money. What all this means for prospects of further reductions? Recently in Berlin, President Obama has made a proposal to reduce deployed strategic nuclear weapons by up to 1/3. From public statements, it's not entirely clear what exactly was meant. Was that an offer just to cut deployed nuclear warheads and leave the same number of deployed launchers? Or the offer assumed reduction of deployed launchers as well? In my view, the second choice is going to be an extremely hard decision for the United States side to make. The US Congress will definitely oppose. It's quite symptomatic that there is no decision yet in the States on how the New START is going to be implemented with regard to launchers. But if the Obama administration would offer to cut the number of deployed launchers, say, by half, the Russian side might really find it attractive to begin the dialogue on the next round of nuclear cuts. On the way to the new agreement, it would be impossible to avoid three major issues already mentioned today. It's non-strategic nuclear weapons, ballistic missile defenses, and strategic conventional arms. It's hard to expect any progress in nuclear reductions unless these three major problems are appropriately addressed and the ways how to resolve them are found. However, if there will be progress on the issues Russia mostly interested in, like ballistic missile defenses or conventional strategic arms, it might reconsider its attitude toward non-strategic nuclear weapons. In other words, if a compromise is reached on development of ballistic missile defenses and conventional armed strategic systems, then prerequisites for discussing transparency measures for non-strategic nuclear weapons might occur. This would represent a major step forward compared to the situation where we are now. What alternative actions could be taken in order to reduce the level of strategic offensive arms? Several options are discussed by my colleagues in the United States now. And in my view, three of them shown on the slide deserve more detailed consideration. Let me focus on the first one. Russia can positively view the idea of accelerated implementation of START. It has already fulfilled its obligations with regard to two of the three START ceilings, and what remains to be done is to reduce the number of non-deployed strategic launchers. However, one needs to take into account one more important factor. Accelerated implementation of START may involve some additional costs that are not in the budgets yet. Therefore, it could be burdensome financially. This may affect not only the United States, but Russia as well. Importantly, in accordance with official data on START implementation over the last 2 years, the number of Russian deployed delivery systems has been declining, while the aggregate number of deployed and non-deployed missile launchers and heavy bombers have been increasing. For financial or some other reasons, Russia is no rush to eliminate its phased-out strategic systems. These circumstances may give the rise to another danger. The START treaty is extremely flexible in terms of options for elimination. In fact, the parties to the treaty can choose an elimination procedure for themselves, and such a procedure doesn't have to be reversible. When the time is short to implement the treaty obligations, there might be a temptation to simplify elimination procedures under the pretext of cost savings. As a result, these reductions may prove to be only formal. The notion of reduction itself devalued, and instead of being an instrument for building confidence, accelerated implementation of START may have an entirely opposite effect. And let me stop here. Thank you for your attention, and I'd be glad to take your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Miasnikov, for your almost scientific presentation full of interesting facts and figures.
I am a scientist.
Yes. It's helpful sometimes to have a scientist among us diplomats and politicians. The next speaker in our panel is also a scientist, Mr. James Acton. He is a senior associate in nuclear policy program at the Carnegie Endowment. He is also a member of Trilateral Commission on Challenges to Deep Cuts and a former member of the International Panel on Fissile Materials, former co-chair of the Next Generation Working Group on US-Russian Arms Control, so a real expert. We are happy to have you here and look forward to your presentation, please.
Thank you very much. And it's a tremendous honor to be here today, especially to be speaking on a panel with Undersecretary Gottemoeller and with my colleagues, Andreas and Evgeny. I was asked to talk about what the next steps for the Prague agenda should be. And I think it's worth recalling that President Obama's inspirational speech in Prague was not just about US-Russia reductions. That they are, of course, a central component of the pathway towards a world without nuclear weapons. The agenda that the President laid out was even more transformative than that because it required global action. Action towards a world without nuclear weapons necessarily involves more than just the United States and Russia. And so what I'd like to do to start is to zoom out and start by looking at the bigger picture of the interactions that will primarily determine the evolution of the world's nuclear arsenals, at least over the medium term. And as some of you will have heard me say before, you can think about the deterrent relationships between key states situated in terms of two triangles. Firstly, you have the US-Russia-China triangle. The United States and Russia both acknowledge they're in a mutual deterrent relationship. The US and China both acknowledge they're in a mutual deterrent relationship. Russia and China don't acknowledge they're in a mutual deterrent relationship, but most of us believe that they really are. And as at the moment, the US and Russia have many more weapons than China. But as the US and Russia come down, there are concerns that China will build up. And I would note that the official Russian position is that the next round of arms control should be multilateral. In fact, the last time I heard it spelled out, the official Russian position was it has to involve every state with nuclear weapons, not just states recognized by the NPT. But China, for its part, is in a deterrent relationship with India, which is in a deterrent relationship with Pakistan. And what goes on in that second triangle can affect what happens in the first triangle. I mean, if China responds to the strategic competition between India and Pakistan, that has relationships between the US and Russia. So in the long term, if we're serious about getting towards a world without nuclear weapons, it's necessary to take into account this global picture, as it is, for that matter, issues such as non-proliferation. Now, I'm going to focus on the first triangle today, on the US-Russia-China triangle. But I think it's important to remember that that doesn't operate in isolation and is connected to events elsewhere. The prospects for another US-Russian bilateral arms control treaty right now, it's hard to say are anything other than pretty poor. To be very clear, I think there are formulae for future US-Russian treaties that would be mutually beneficial and are an extremely good idea. but it's hard to see them being realized, at least in the short term. And as we've heard from previous speakers, there's a fundamental asymmetry in goals between the United States and Russia. The United States is primarily concerned about dealing with nuclear weapons. Tactical nuclear weapons, strategic nuclear weapons. The US has also indicated an interest in dealing with non-deployed strategic nuclear weapons, the stuff that's not sitting on the nose cones of missiles but is sitting in storage. Russian concerns are primarily about US conventional weaponry. Ballistic missile defense is an example of US conventional weapons that Russia has expressed concern about. High-precision conventional weapons that Evgeny has termed strategic conventional weapons are another area of Russian concern. And this asymmetry between what the US wants to achieve and what Russia wants to achieve would be hard to solve at the best of times. And diplomatically between the US and Russia right now, it's hard to say that these are the best of times. And there are times when in my more cynical moments, perhaps I start to believe that Russia's not serious about making progress on a further arms control treaty. Earlier this year, the United States cancelled phase 4 of the European phased adaptive approach for ballistic missile defense. Now that was done because technologically it wasn't going to work. But some of us were hoping for a slightly more positive reaction from Russia, which has spent the last 4 years complaining about phase 4 of the European phase adaptive approach, and hoped that when it was cancelled for other reasons, it may have opened up a pathway to arms control. But apparently I was being too optimistic there. Indeed, perhaps one could, even if one was being extremely cynical, suggest that the lack of official Russian representation here today is a reflection of Russia's position. But I'm not that cynical. Instead, the attitude that I take is if at first you don't succeed, try again, but try something different. So far, cooperation on ballistic missile defense has not successfully been pulled off. Cooperation on tactical nuclear weapons has not been successfully pulled off, and the Conventional Forces in Europe Treaty seems in a not terribly good state. So what does that leave? Well, I think the answer is strategic conventional weapons, which is what Evgeny was talking about significantly. Partly, when we try to think about areas in which the US and Russia could cooperate, partly I think this is a promising area because we haven't seriously explored this yet as far as I can see. And partly for reasons that I'm going to explain, I think there is really genuinely mutually beneficial progress that can be made on this front. Just to kind of re-emphasize what Evgeny has said, is the argument that Russia is making is that US high-precision conventional weaponry could be capable of attacking Russian nuclear forces, and that the smaller Russia's nuclear force becomes, the more vulnerable it is to US high-precision conventional weaponry. Now, I think Russia has exaggerated the extent to which high-precision conventional weapons can attack Russian nuclear forces. I think to some extent, if there is a problem, it's self-inflicted in terms of building a new ICBM with multiple warheads and sticking it in a silo. Sounds to me like sticking lots of plutonium eggs inside each ballistic basket makes Russia's own problems bigger. That said, let me acknowledge that Russian fears, I think, are very real. I may say they're exaggerated, but as an analyst, I have to accept that these are real fears that have to be dealt with. And moreover, reading the writing by Russian experts, and on this subject, I'm sitting on a panel with perhaps the foremost Russian NGO expert on this subject, it's clear that Russian concerns are not exclusively, and probably not even primarily, about ultra-fast systems that are currently in research and development, so-called conventional prompt global strike systems that are very long range and hypersonic. Russian fears are about cruise missiles, they're about gravity bombs, they're about non-prompt systems. But there's something useful here, because Russia is investing as indeed Undersecretary Gottemoeller has pointed out publicly before, Russia is investing in some of these exactly the same systems that it's complaining the United States is developing. And this, it seems to me, opens up opportunities for cooperative confidence building that is reciprocal, which makes it easier to be seen as mutually beneficial. And I think there's a huge amount that could be done here. Data exchanges, revealing the procurement plans, deployment patterns in the broadest of terms. There is a genuine technical disagreement between the United States and Russia over the extent to which cruise missiles and other weapons pose threats to silos. Why not get the US and Russian national academies together to do a technical study to try to understand this? And if they can't reach a theoretical conclusion as to whether these weapons pose a threat to Russian strategic forces, why not do experiments? There's silos, particularly in the US, that are being dismantled pursuant to New START. Why not, as a way of dismantling those silos, test the effect that conventional weapons have on them? I think there's also dialogue needed on these prompt systems between the US and Russia. Russia has indicated, the United States has a well-known program of record called Conventional Prompt Global Strike, which is a research and development effort to develop long-range, high-precision conventional weapons. Russia has made statements that it's interested in developing similar systems. It's a lot easier to manage these concerns before these systems are deployed than after they're deployed. So given there are technological choices to be made here, a dialogue on which systems are more destabilizing and less destabilizing, what kind of confidence building measures would needed to be put into place, I think could be very beneficial at this stage. A lot of what I'm talking about here is confidence building rather than treaty-based. That's not because I think another treaty is a bad idea. On the contrary, I think another treaty is a very good idea. But because right now I think more informal confidence building measures are doable, they're a way of restarting cooperation, and if they succeed, they make a future treaty more likely, not less likely. Now, I started off by talking a bit about China, and that's also where I want to end, because there are clear similarities between Russian concerns and Chinese concerns. China is often criticized for being very opaque about its nuclear posture. And that's very true. China has also been extremely restrained to date. And what China would say is its opaqueness is because of its, its opaqueness is because of its restraint. That if China was to be more transparent about its nuclear forces, then they would become less survivable and it would have to build those nuclear forces up. And China has expressed concern about exactly the same programs that Russia has expressed concern about: ballistic missile defense, high-precision conventional weapons. And I think those concerns are reasonable and legitimate, as are concerns that the United States has expressed about the development of Chinese strategic modernization. The United States is concerned that China's strategic modernization is not only a defensive reaction, maybe not at all a defensive reaction to the US, but is about wanting to have the capability of changing the status quo and interfering with US extended deterrence commitments in East Asia. I don't think we can ignore the dynamics between the US and China, because I think they are going to, over the long run, be every bit as important as US-Russian dynamics on the path to zero. And neither is, I think, it's simply tenable to say China should just join the arms control process. We should all sit around at a table and negotiate 5-way or 8-way or 9-way or 10-way or whatever reductions, because it's very good rhetoric, but it's very bad policy. Instead, I think what's needed with China is actually something fairly similar to what I've sketched out with Russia. The United States government has been trying to start a dialogue, a one-to-one dialogue with China on strategic security, which has met with little success so far. A P5 dialogue that's going on is kind of the first signs that it might be moving a bit. But again, I think on this subject of high-precision conventional weapons, and it's certainly harder to orchestrate in the Chinese context than the Russian context, but I think there's genuine possibility, maybe not this year or next year, but maybe this decade, for real cooperation. China, not only is China developing the same kind of high-precision conventional weapons that the US is, China has already deployed them. many of you here may have not heard of something called the DF-21D anti-ship ballistic missile, but in Washington it's a subject that is talked about on a minutely basis, let alone a daily basis. It's a ballistic missile that's designed to target US aircraft carriers. It is a very, very similar technology to the conventional prompt global strike program that China says threatens its nuclear forces. There seems to me a real possibility here for, initially a dialogue, but hopefully practical measures, such as data exchanges. Over the long run, maybe even bans on encryption of telemetry during testing, so that each side can better understand the capabilities of the other. The point, zooming out from the details that I hope you take away from these remarks today, are firstly that this is bigger than just a US-Russia process. US-Russia is critical to the future of getting to zero. It is necessary, but it's not sufficient. And secondly, that I think not only can one not ignore the strategic conventional dimension, but I think there are genuinely mutual beneficial avenues for cooperation on that front that can help restart a process that frankly seems to have stalled. And I very much look forward to having a conversation on this subject. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Acton, for presenting alternative ways how to go about nuclear weapons reduction, additional areas to look at, and also possible measures that could be taken. The last speaker in our panel is Mr. Andreas Persbo. He's an executive director of the Verification Research Training and Information Center in London. He specializes in nuclear arms control and also deals and liaises with IAEA, CTBT, and is watching NPT. So we look forward to hear from you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and let me join my fellow speakers in thanking the organizers for inviting me yet again. It's a pleasure to be back in Prague. I was here last year. I don't think I mentioned last year that obviously being Swedish, Czechoslovakia has a very interesting or the former Czechoslovakia has a very interesting relationship with the Swedes, because some of our favorite cartoons when we grew up were actually Czechoslovakian. It was about this professor that had a fantastic machine that he used to solve problems with. Swedish TV, by law, had to show cartoons from both the Eastern and the Western blocks, so to speak, since we're completely neutral, obviously. And my favorite ones were always from the East. And as it happens, actually, I don't know if it's by design, but the Westerners are on my left side, and us from the East are on the right side. Stockholm obviously being further east than Prague. That's interesting, isn't it? But anyway, thank you very much. Vienna is further east than Prague, indeed. In any case, I've been asked to give a few thoughts on the Prague agenda after President Obama's Berlin speech on the 19th of June. And like so many others in this room, I welcomed very much the President's speech here in Prague. I thought that it injected a breath of optimism in a field mostly plagued by negative thinking, such as ours. But it also served a very important function. It galvanized our thoughts and our actions around a single vision, namely a world without nuclear weapons. Yesterday, I heard someone say that the vision thing is not so important. It's more important to engage on practical things. I'm not so sure I agree with that, because every building needs an architect, and every building needs a great vision. This fantastic palace wouldn't have been built unless someone came up with a grand plan for it. 4 years ago, the President presented his blueprint, And it was ambitious, and it was difficult, and we know this. And unsurprisingly, the president was criticized by his enemies, perhaps, for precisely that, promising an action plan that many felt was unachievable. Delivering a vision is a very difficult thing. Michael Kreppen, a good friend of mine, he wrote in earlier this year in June, getting the vision thing right is hard. The ability to deliver a stirring speech, enunciating idealistic goals is a start, but without a successful follow-up, the vision seems hollow. So 4 years on, after Prague, can one say that President Obama's vision is hollow? I would not go so far. Some things did get implemented, and Rose mentioned them, and I will also touch on them. Some issues were left on the to-do list. For arms controllers, admittedly, the Berlin speech delivered in June was more muted than the one delivered in Prague. And I think it's possible to draw fundamentally different conclusions from this, but my conclusion is that President Obama's vision remains virtually unchanged. Here in Prague, he said that nuclear weapons were the most dangerous legacy of the Cold War. In Berlin, he actually added a stronger sentence: so long as nuclear weapons exist, we are not truly safe. His vision is getting stronger in my mind. Obama's vision is intact. He remains committed to an abolitionist vision. But I would also say that while the Prague speech was characteristic of the president's first term, perhaps enthusiastic and full of ambition, the Berlin speech was colored by 5 years of experience in international affairs. I think it's clear that some things are easy to achieve, others are more difficult, and all things come at a price. Let's look at what was delivered. As Rose mentioned, the Prague speech set off the nuclear security summit process, and I think the outcome of the nuclear security summit process will be one of the enduring legacies of the president's agenda as set out in this city 4 years ago. Much more work has now gone into making radioactive materials more secure. The summit process have included a very large cross-section of the nuclear arms control community. Indeed, even my own organization, Vertic, has been involved by preparing a nuclear legislation implementation kit on nuclear security on the request of the Indonesian government, which we will present as the Indonesian gift next year. Just to mention, it involves both governments, NGOs, the International Atomic Energy Agency. And speaking of the IAEA, last year we had the director of the Office of Nuclear Security here, and he was talking about what they were doing to advance the nuclear security agenda. The office will be transformed. It will grow into a division. More resources will be put into this. This is an enduring legacy. The United States, the president announced in Berlin, will host the next summit in 2016. Well, there is one next year, but the one after this. It is widely rumored in our community that this will be the last summit, after which this process will transform into something else, perhaps on ambassador level, less high profile. This is not necessarily a bad thing, I want to stress. Nuclear security is now here to stay, and I think this is an endurable good. Formulating fully and implementing a nuclear security regime will take many, many more years to come, and this is true, but one cannot deny that the summit process have accelerated this process. Another more high-profile checkbox was also ticked after Prague, and we talked about that, and that's obviously the New START Treaty. And coming from an organization that deals with verification and implementation, we were, of course, extremely pleased to see that verification reappeared in the New START Treaty after the unverifiable Moscow Treaty. These negotiations were difficult and from time to time painful, I hear. But progress does not come without pain. The treaty entered into force, and it was signed here in Prague, entered into force in February 2011. It will remain in force until 2021, perhaps even longer. And as Rose said, according to the president, the two countries are now on track to cut deployed nuclear weapons to their lowest level since the 1950s. This achievement cannot be understated, I think. and the international community should welcome it, despite the challenges that may lie ahead. Now, not everything is rosy, of course. 2 principal items from the Prague speech remains on the to-do list, and the President repeated those items in Berlin, and I'm referring to negotiations on the fissile material treaty or fissile material cutoff treaty, whatever your preference is, and of course, the pending US ratification of the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. The President's point, his language on these 2 points are considerably more muted today than it was in Prague. 4 years ago, Obama's language on the fissile material treaty implied a US leadership role. 4 years later, today, he simply calls on all nations to begin negotiations on a treaty, not even calling for it to begin as soon as possible. We all know that negotiations on this treaty has been deadlocked in the Conference on Disarmament for more than a decade. And I, for one, think that breaking this deadlock may well be beyond the gift of the US President. He may be powerful, but he's not all powerful. Several CD members appear unconvinced that this treaty is in their national interest. South Asian diplomats privately often raised the arguments about the need to shore up their own fissile material stockpiles before committing to cutoff. And unless the proposed treaty aims to regulate materials that are already produced, getting a deal here will be exceptionally difficult. So I think that Obama's statement on the fissile material treaty in Berlin is nothing more than a simple recognition, maybe painful to admit this sometimes, especially for the US President, but a simple recognition of the boundaries of the US's influence. We are unlikely to see much more progress here, I want to stress, unless states are willing to negotiate this treaty in a smaller group of nations. And there are obvious risks in this. A fissile material cutoff treaty negotiated amongst, say, the P5 may not later be adhered to by the other 4. And of course, to me, it appears that Mr. Obama is not willing to take those risks. Instead, he prefers to await a broadly, multilaterally negotiated outcome. Another issue relates, of course, to more to domestic policy. In 2009, the administration stated that it would immediately and aggressively pursue ratification of the CTBT. And this was welcomed with open arms and applause in Vienna, obviously. But this aggressiveness and this decisiveness quickly subsided once it became clear that ratifying a new arms reduction agreement with the Russian Federation would require expending a very large amount of political capital. So, in many ways, the CTBT appears to be the victim of political expediency. And I'm afraid to say I believe that the window of opportunity to seek its ratification appears to be closing in the United States. One does not need to live in Washington, D.C. to understand that politics there is at a divisive high point right now, and that it's enough to open the editorial pages of the New York Times to understand that. And I think this is reflected in the President's Berlin speech. He is now content to simply work to build support within the United States for this important treaty. And I think many in this room will feel disappointed about this, obviously. But I think it's also equally important by a statesman to manage expectations. I don't think he does this treaty any good if he promises anything that he knows will be too difficult to deliver. One way or another, the CTBT will enter into force. I am convinced about that. The drafters of the treaty, though, did not do us any favors by insisting on this exceptionally difficult entry into force clause. And of course, even if the US ratifies, there are many more other states that will be difficult to convince to sign up to this treaty in Annex 2. It may still be an unpopular thought amongst many, including in this room, I suspect, but provisional entry into force of this treaty will need to be discussed and considered one day. I, for one, think that that day should come sooner rather than later, but this is something I've held for many years and not always been loved for. So what's new? Well, James already spoke about this. The first principal element is this unilateral undertaking to reduce the deployed arsenal by up to 1/3. The second element is to seek a bold reduction of US and Russian tactical nuclear weapons in Europe. Let me say that I agree with those that says that there does not appear to be any appetite amongst decision makers in the Russian Federation to talk about tactical nuclear weapons. And the President's unilateral undertaking is of course well within his gift to deliver, but I note Eugene's point that the Congress may well oppose to this. But I think the unilateral undertaking symbolizes another thing that is perhaps more important, and that is that the marginal utility, and I'm talking about utility on the margin here, not overall utility, the marginal utility of the weapons in the United States and Russia right now is almost zero. Well, it is zero, because if it had utility, there wouldn't be pressure to reduce arsenals. And that means that at some point there is, what it means is that there is such a thing as one nuclear weapon too much. And I think actually that is quite optimistic to think about it in that way. If these weapons had any value on the margin, there wouldn't be an incentive to get rid of them. One warhead less doesn't make the United States or Russia worse off. But a word of caution here. I think one should expect this downward trend to slow down and stabilize over time. And I saw Eugene's graphs were actually kind of just flatlining towards the end there. Well, the symbolism of that, I don't need to. Flatlining towards the end there. But when stockpiles reach an optimal level, expect very little movement without a fundamental change in, the way statesmen assign value to these weapons. In any case, if you're an abolitionist, which Obama is, one warhead less is certainly something worth welcoming. In conclusion, I think that the combined Berlin-Prague agenda, if that is a suitable term and acceptable to our gracious hosts, appears to show promise as well, but I think it's more tempered by reality. This is a president that is perhaps a little bit more seasoned, a little bit more battered after many years of politics. He certainly has more gray hairs. But as a good wine, perhaps a French wine, and our French colleagues are gone, as a good wine, the president's nuclear policies appear to have matured, but without loss of the underlying vision and taste. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Persbo, for highlighting the legacy of President Obama's Prague speech and its melting into Berlin-Prague agenda, and also for generally optimistic outlook for the future. Our panelists today were rather disciplined, so we have about 25 minutes for discussion now. Here in the first row, we have a group of discussants that I guess are eager to talk and ask questions. But of course, anyone from the public, if you want to speak, please raise your hand, and well, we will try to take as many questions, accommodate as many people as possible. Please.
Thanks for very interesting remarks. I wanted to pick up on one of the issues about what's different between the Prague speech and the Berlin speech. And one of the things that strikes me, of course, in there is the choice of language in the pledge to seek bold reductions in non-strategic nuclear weapons. And I want to ask you, Rose, about it because of the language, first of all, appearing there, and to what extent it, in your view, reflects something new, since it wasn't in Prague, and whether, and to what extent bold reductions are honestly realistic in non-strategic nuclear weapons, given that all we've really seen, for example, NATO being able to talk among itself about, but also the hopes and aspiration for talking with Russia about further steps, so far hasn't gotten much further than to sort of increase transparency and confidence building measures. So I'm wondering, what does that sentence mean? Is it sort of a far future aspiration, or is there something new that you imagine is coming up?
Thank you very much. Maybe we can take a couple of, or do you want to answer right now? Mr. Kibri.
Thank you very much. I have a question for Madam Undersecretary. Mrs. Undersecretary, if you lean back for a minute and give us, and I would like to take up your metaphor of darkness, and you look at the current situation and contextualize the START issue in the East-West context, what are the reasons, how would you describe the current East-West situation? Is it precarious, and what are the reasons about it? Is it because your country is not strong enough and Russia is not weak enough? Is it about security or about status? Is it about delineating spheres of interests? At what point did the East-West communication go astray? My hunch of it is, my take of it is that it is sometimes easier to talk in the darkness than if you apply the color of grayness. And if you look back, the arms control process started when two symmetrical powers were adversaries. And maybe it's easier to conclude treaties with adversaries than among partners or non-friends or friends or whatever they were that are hard to define. So at what point do you think did a communication that went out so well between Mr. Obama and Mr. Putin became a problem? Thank you.
Thank you very much. More questions at this particular moment, please.
Thank you very much. Alan Ware from Parliamentarians for Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament. I had a question for Rose Gottemoeller with regards to implementation of the US Nuclear Posture Review. There was in the Nuclear Posture Review an affirmation that the role of nuclear weapons is primarily to deter other nuclear weapons, with a commitment to move towards sole purpose. Is there any movement on these doctrinal changes to lower the role of nuclear weapons in US doctrine? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we now let, in particular, Rose, but the other panelists to answer.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me start with a question about the current East-West situation, whether it's precarious or not. It'll kind of set the stage for our discussion, I think. My opinion is that it's not precarious so much as varied at the moment, quite honestly. I mean, there are clearly some severe differences between Moscow and Washington at the moment. You have only to look at our debates over Syria policy to understand that, in fact, there are some areas where we have great differences with Russia's views at this moment. But nevertheless, we are continuing to work for a political solution and a basically solution at the negotiating table with an aspiration to get back to Geneva and engage there in talks that would bring us to a political solution to the conflict in Syria. And when I say varied, you know, again, I talked about what happens on the quiet front in my remarks. I would never have expected during the Cold War years that we would be supplying our troops in Afghanistan over Russian territory. And people forget about the importance of what is sometimes called the Northern Distribution Network in terms of supplying not only the US forces, but all ISAF forces, the NATO forces that are working together in Afghanistan. So I just bring that up as an example because where you see from the headlines that of course we're at loggerheads with the Russians over a number of issues. We disagree with them profoundly about how to handle the situation in Syria at the present time in the Assad regime. Nevertheless, in a number of areas where I never would have predicted a close working relationship, we do have a close and vital working relationship that I see no signs of weakening at the present time. So that's the first point. It's a difficult situation at the present time, but I would just ask you to consider its variety at the moment, that there are positive aspects that are behind the curtain or in more of a quiet space, but that they continue to go forward in a very pragmatic overall way. Now let me turn next to the views about reductions and where we go from here, bold reductions in non-strategic nuclear weapons. Let me come to that in a moment because there were a couple points that were made by my colleagues that I'd like to pull into sharper focus. First of all, what the President spoke about in Berlin was not a unilateral undertaking. The President talked about seeking negotiated reductions along with the Russian Federation. And so I wanted to stress that. There were three options that were laid out here by Eugene Miasnikov that are quite popular now to debate and discuss among the non-governmental experts in the United States and in the international community as well. But they are not under active consideration. We are looking at further negotiated reductions with the Russian Federation, and we are working in that direction with the Russians. And I was quite interested actually to hear Yevgeny say that there could be an interest in limiting delivery vehicles on the Russian side. That seems to be another misapprehension, that we're only talking about further reductions in deployed warheads. We're actually talking about further reductions in all three of the central limitations of the New START Treaty: operationally deployed warheads, operationally deployed delivery vehicles, and the third, which is deployed and non-deployed launchers. So I think when you look at that constellation of further reductions, there is something in it for the Russians. Consider the graph that Yevgeny put up there, where he talked about the fact that under even a best case over the next decade, we're talking about 400 approximately deployed delivery vehicles on the Russian side. Well, you know, to me, that looks like an interesting option for the Russians to seek reductions in US delivery vehicles, because we're not nearly as pressured as the Russians are. Our delivery vehicle numbers now are up above the level of the New START Treaty, which is 700. We only have to reach that level by 2018, which is the date of implementation of the New START Treaty, February 2018. So you see, I think there is something in it for the Russians, and obviously that's still a discussion we have going with the Kremlin, with the Russian Federation, but it will be an important, I think, discussion in coming months, and will depend very much, I know, and I agree with James's point, we need to have a broad-ranging discussion of these strategic stability issues, which we've already agreed to pursue. We need to talk about missile defense issues, cooperation on missile defense, and we need to talk about issues like conventional long-range, both highly accurate but also prompt and non-prompt conventional systems. So we need to talk about all those issues, and I welcome very much some of the ideas I heard this morning in that regard. Now, coming back to the point about bold reductions in non-strategic nuclear weapons, it's very interesting, you know, because frankly, I think none of us appreciated at the point we started, and we were pressed on this during New START ratification by our Senate, you know, You've got to pursue reductions in non-strategic nuclear weapons. Nobody understood, I think, the complexity of that in terms of how we work together with our NATO allies, how we work together with other allies around the world, including in Asia. They must also understand the implications of such reductions. So when we're talking about bold reductions in the current context, it's because this whole issue has been pulled into a lot sharper focus now in Washington. And we realize the degree to which we need to pursue complex transparency measures that involve not only things like data exchange, information exchange, but also look to other kinds of more complicated transparency measures, such as site visits and so forth. That, I think, is one aspect of it, but then also thinking about the transition from what we're looking at in the first instance, which is transparency, into how we would structure a reduction agreement that would involve non-strategic nuclear weapons with the Russian Federation. So I think that is what is meant. It's an aspect of boldness, not only in the nature of the reductions per se, but boldness in terms of the intellectual challenge of properly structuring the next phase of reductions that involves non-strategic forces. So I look forward again to further comments on this. I think we'll have some chances to talk about it during our breaks, but it's really, I think, a very important phase. And the last thing I'll say is that up to this point, in the 40 years of limitation and reduction of strategic nuclear forces, we have really focused on the operationally deployed. We have never tried to tackle warheads that have not been associated with their delivery vehicles, whether we're talking about non-strategic systems that are shorter in range, or whether we're talking about strategic delivery vehicles, and looking at so-called non-deployed warheads that are held in storage or held in reserve. These are quite significant challenges for the verification and inspection regimes particularly. And this is another area that I think requires a lot more work in the expert community going forward. By the way, and I will end with this, I think it looks like we are right on the cusp of being able to sign with the Russians a new research and development agreement between the Russian Atomic Energy Agency and the Department of Energy, National Nuclear Security Administration. This new R&D agreement will enable, I think, some very important work, including on warhead safety, security, and monitoring and verification. So, you know, again, this is an example of how our bilateral relationship is quite varied right now. When you are thinking about, you know, how difficult it is, what the headlines tell you, yes, it is difficult. But down below the surface in other areas, there is still some very good and very challenging work going on. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Are there comments from other panelists on what has been said or asked? No, so then please, other questions? Mr. Brooks.
Linton Brooks from the United States. I'd be interested, Evgeny, in your view of the acceptability of the ideas that James put forward about conventional strategic as a standalone discussion. I serve on the National Academy of Sciences CSAC panel, and I must say that when we have presented those ideas, I have not detected nearly the enthusiasm I would have hoped. So I'd be interested in your view of whether this is attractive to the Russian Federation. And for the Undersecretary, I wonder if you think, I mean, we've had a lot of discussion about prompt global strike in Washington, but I've detected very little enthusiasm in the Pentagon for talking about anything that involves cruise missiles. And I'd be interested in your assessment about whether the kind of discussion James was talking about on cruise missiles, which we really have, as opposed to something that may or may not survive the budget process, whether that's a bridge too far in here. And then finally, a comment. It was suggested that it was easier to negotiate during the Cold War, and I will simply say it didn't feel that way at the time.
Thank you very much. We now have the gentleman in the second row. Yes.
Thank you. I am Jan Smetana from the Center for Security Studies at Metropolitan University Prague. And I have a question for Mr. Acton. You had interesting speech about global context, but I would like to ask you about your opinion in role of the Great Britain and France as a world nuclear power. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The lady in the second row.
Thank you. I'm Jana Jedličková from Prague Vision Institute for Sustainable Security. There is a UN high-level meeting on nuclear disarmament in a few weeks in New York. I would like to ask Ms. Gottemoeller if Mr. Obama is going to participate in person and if he's going to take this opportunity to reaffirm his vision of nuclear weapons-free world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we might take one more question, please.
Yes, thank you. I'm Nikolai Sokov, probably Vienna Center for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation. James, it was an excellent presentation. I liked everything that you said. One question, do you think that conventional high-precision assets might be included into the CFE context here, like in Europe, to kind of like amend, replace whatever the old CFE treaty? And a related question to Rose, do you think that Senate will allow actually discussion of long-range conventional assets in the view of the ratification of New START? And yeah, maybe just a word to Lynn. Actually, I think that there is an interest in the Pentagon about discussing cruise missiles. At least, yes, I've seen that, yes, and we can exchange the experience. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we might now start with Mr. Acton in answering the questions.
Thank you. On the UK and France, when I was kind of painting that picture of the two triangles, that wasn't implying the UK and France don't have responsibilities. Russia, indicates. Sorry, let me take a step back. What it was implying was that certainly in the short and medium term, the evolution of the world's nuclear arsenals will not be primarily dependent on the UK and France. I think it's fair to say Russia is significantly more worried about China's nuclear weapons than about Britain and France's, which is not to say that Russia has no concerns about British and French nuclear weapons, but, it's got its priorities. The way that I see it, though, is the UK and France are going to have to be as involved as China is in any kind of negotiations or discussions. I mean, there's a reason why the track 1 negotiations are done on a P5 level rather than a P3 level. And if we ever get to the point of having multilateral negotiations, which we are a very long way from, then that's going to have to be done on a 5-way level, if not more. And then for the shorter term, I do think that there is more, and I've been shouted at for French diplomats by saying this before, but I think there is more that, and UK diplomats privately tell me off for saying it, but they don't shout at me in public. There is more that can be done. I think the UK and France could very usefully do things like adopt on a voluntary basis some of the reporting requirements in New START. I think that would be a good faith way of fulfilling their part of the Article 6 bargain. On Nikolai's question, okay, I've never thought about the idea of including conventional prompt global strike in CFE, so my answer is kind of off the top of my head, and I reserve the right to change it after rethinking it. My sense is CPGS weapons are much more likely to be, they have many more resemblances in terms of how you would account for them with strategic nuclear weapons than with tanks and armored personnel carriers and aircraft. I mean, CPGS weapons are either, if they are ever developed, and that's an if they are ever developed, they will either be launched off using converted former nuclear weapon delivery vehicles or new delivery vehicles that look an awful lot like former nuclear weapon delivery vehicles. So it does simplify, you do have a nice framework for them to fit into. And finally, I would just say in reference to Linton's point, I think you might, if you go to the Pentagon, are you interested in unilaterally talking about US cruise missiles, and are you interested in something that's genuinely reciprocal, you might get different answers.
Thank you very much. Please, Rose, if you want to continue.
All right, I realize I did not answer one of the previous questions, which is whether the implementation of the new nuclear employment guidance had begun to develop in terms of movement in U.S. doctrine, and the answer is yes. What happens when one of these nuclear employment decisions is made by the President is that it is then passed to the Secretary of Defense, who conveys his guidance then to the uniformed military, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and then to the Strategic Command. So yes, that process has already begun of going from the President's signature from his desk through the leadership on the civilian side of the Pentagon and down to the Strategic Command in Omaha. And they have already begun to implement changes in targeting based on those decisions that were made. So yes, that is the regular routine is being followed. It's a regular routine, although it's not a frequent routine. This is only the third time that employment guidance has been changed since the Cold War ended. So first was in 1994 when President Clinton issued his guidance, and then later in 2002, Bush administration, and now President Obama. So yes, that process has begun. Prompt global strike, we had quite a debate over that word prompt, but what we have said to the Russians now is we want to discuss the full range, not just prompt systems. So the answer to your question is yes, we have agreed among ourselves and talked to the Russians about discussing the broad range of such conventional, long-range, highly accurate systems. You know, Nikolai's question about will the Senate allow, I always get my back up when I hear will the Senate allow. It's up to us in the executive branch to work together and consult with our colleagues in the legislative branch and really determine what is in U.S. national security interest. But we start from a calculation of what is in U.S. national security interest. And then if we come around to a ratification process, such as the New START Treaty ratification process, it is then incumbent on us to make the case to Capitol Hill that indeed what was accomplished at the negotiating table is in U.S. national security interests. So we don't start with the question of what the Senate will allow. We start with the question of what is in U.S. national security interests. So I just want to emphasize that point, Nikolai. And finally, the very simple question about the high-level meeting in New York. I will be representing the United States at the high-level meeting in New York.
Thank you, Rose. Eugene, you wanted to come.
Great question, Linton. As already Rose said, there are discussions among US and Russian officials on the wide range of conventional systems that are perceived as a factor in strategic stability talks. I think two aspects have to be taken into account when we talk about strategic conventional system. First aspect is there is a concern on the Russian side about survivability of strategic systems against conventional strike. They assume that some conventional systems, especially a long-range precision system, might have counterforce capability. This is one aspect. Another aspect is implicitly, previous START agreements actually took into account such systems. For example, regardless what's on top of the missiles, conventional nuclear warhead, they were all considered as strategic systems. The same is true for many of the bombers. For example, B-1B bombers were still accounted by START treaty, in spite of the fact that the nuclear tasks were withdrawn from these bombers, and cruise missile carrying submarines, Trident submarines, also were accounted by START, and there were also verification procedures to inspect them. And with new START, this trend, there is a clear trend that conventional systems are taken out of accounting and out of inspection regime. In my view, the Russians haven't decided yet, actually, what systems for themselves, what systems they consider as strategic in a sense. Because sometimes they go that far as to include unmanned aerial combat vehicles. And the issue, I think, still needs to be discussed both in the Russian expert community and also among non-governmental experts of United States and Russia. And in this connection, I would highly recommend a recent report written by James Acton. I think it's very profound analysis of the problem, and it really presents views which were not common for most of the readers. And I think it's a very helpful tool, both for the experts in the West and also in Russia as well, to understand the real situation. In particular, I'm pretty sure most of military experts in Russia have very bare, very vague idea of what was going with global strike programs in the United States, and after carefully studying this report, perhaps their conclusion might change, I think, about the danger of these systems. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid we have exhausted the time that was allotted to this panel. Is there any urgent question and comment someone feels needs to be made at this moment? So if we cut on the coffee time very quickly, please.
Okay, thanks a lot. Excuse me, actually it was a bit late, but I'm just raising a point of regional issue. And I would like to ask Mrs. Rose about the Middle East. And there are so many initiatives actually in the past to create a Middle East free zone of nuclear weapons. And nowadays actually the situation is very critical, especially after actually the dramatical events in Syria. So will this be a positive or negative actually start to the initiatives of freeing Middle East from the nuclear weapons? And what is the situation now, especially US taking, it's about to launch a military attack on Syria. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. I think this topic will be very much part of the next panel where the facilitator is also participating. Okay. But Rose, if you want to say a few words.
I will just say that this effort is part of the action plan from the 2010 NPT review conference, and we have been working very hard with all the interested parties, and I want to give a word of praise as I'm on this podium to the work of Ambassador Yakolayeva, who is here and will be in our next panel, but I can assure you that all of the parties have been working very hard to bring this to fruition, and I, for one, continue to hope that we can implement this particular action from the action plan in the very near future. So I do think it would be an excellent step to be able to bring it to fruition. You are right that the situation in the Middle East currently complicates efforts, but nevertheless, I'm by no means pessimistic that we'll be able to accomplish it. If, with the chair's permission, I'd just like to clarify, and perhaps I misunderstood you, Yevgeny, but under the New START Treaty, one of the important aspects of counting under the New START Treaty is that conventional prompt, so-called conventional prompt global strike, ICBMs and SLBMs that are armed, if we ever deploy them with conventional weapons, they're not currently deployed, they would be counted and be also inspectable under the New START Treaty's terms. So I just wanted to clarify that actually in that particular category of weapon systems, if they were ever deployed, they would fall under the constraint regime of the New START Treaty. So thank you.
One word, Eugene.
You're absolutely correct, Rose, regarding the ICBMs and SLBMs. I'm mostly talking about conventional heavy bombers, B-1Bs, which initially were accounted by New START in the beginning. But now they, let me put it in this word. The inspection regime regarding for example, B-1B bombers is much more restricted than in the beginning when New START was implemented.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank you, Rose, for the presentation. Thanks to Eugene, James, Andreas. As a conclusion, I think we can say there is still a lot of work to do, so the future of our conferences is secured for many years to come. Now, I would like also to thank all the participants in the discussion. Now we have a coffee break. We will meet here again at 11:10 with the permission of the panelists for the next panel. Thank you very much.